Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the past, September 22nd, actually. Um, Hanyu Wang persuaded me to record early, reminding me of that the radiation and chemotherapy might make my voice inaudible if I wait until October. So um, let's start. Subjective necessity of nonviolence. Well, it would have been the first time Jeff Turner, my partner for 29 years, would have been in this room. It would not have been mine. I've been there before, many times and over several decades. You see, I started, but could not have brought off without the invaluable assistance of my co-director, Janet Miller, the JCT associated conferences. JCT, a journal I also started, but could not have brought off without Janet Miller, who served as managing editor. The first of these meetings was held at the Early House in Warrenton, Virginia. That location thanks to the University of Virginia professor Charles W. Beagle, a student of Paul Clore, as is Janet Miller and Tom Petter's mentor at Indiana University, Norm Overly. The year was 1978. Bill Schubert might have been there. James B. McDonald was. At those first meetings, our conference wasn't large enough to occupy the entire place. Maybe our second year there, we learned that we were sharing the place with the CIA, a fact that prompted us to move the meeting. I think it was through University of Dayton professor Joseph Watrous that Paul Clore learned of the Bergamo Center. As you know, associated with the Catholic Church, not the CIA, but another institution not all progressive people appreciate. Paul and I drove there in 1981. I was still teaching at the University of Rochester, where I had met Janet Miller, and we decided it would do. The first conference was held there in 1982. The name JCT conference, soon replaced by the Bergamo conference, informally only, as the conference site director discouraged us from officially adopting the name. In this room, then, where I've been so many times before, I am responding to the call of nonviolence, a call Hanyu Wang heard first and resounded to the rest of us in curriculum studies. What I'm presenting is a course of study, juxtaposing a term Janet Miller brought to my attention, one also developed by Teresa Strong-Wilson, a series of fragments, a term Tom Petter employs in his new and moving book titled Curriculum Fragments. A literary philosophical term, fragment is also a scientific, specifically geological term, as geologists reconstruct the past by using mere fragments to tell a larger story. If you'd like to glimpse Tom's curriculum fragments before asking your university library to purchase a copy, go to curriculumstudies.ca, scroll down the table of contents on the left, click on our YouTube channel, and there, among other offerings, you'll find the book launches I've hosted. Among them Tom's, but also others, including the launch of James Burns' important new book, Curriculum and the Problem of Violence, Biopolitics, Truth, History, and Fascism, as well as Hanyu Wang's 2021 book, Contemporary Taoism, Organic Relationality, and a Curriculum of Integrative Creativity. Other curriculum studies texts I'd like to acknowledge as influential are Hanyu Wang's Awakenings to the Calling of Nonviolence in Curriculum Studies, and that preceded by her 2014 book, Nonviolence in Education, Cross-Cultural Pathways. James B. Burns, the aforementioned Curriculum and the Problem of Violence. Christopher Cruz, Curriculum as Confession. Molly Quinn's Peace and Pedagogy. And Kathy Bickmore's forthcoming collection, Constructive Conflict Pedagogies for Building Democratic Peace, Teaching Strategies from Around the World. On Bickmore's recently published essay, Schooling for Building a Just Peace, Comparative and Canadian Perspectives, which appeared in the recently released Curriculum Studies in Canada, I will comment now. Fragment number 1. A fragment telling a larger story. Number 1. Despite Canadian commitments to peace, pluralism, and multiculturalism, Bickmore points out that the Canadian schools are also shaped by their parent, quote, patriarchal settler state. That painful paradox preoccupies Bickmore. She has focused her curriculum research on persistent violence, disproportionately affecting marginalized people. She wonders how the curriculum might address violence and social justice conflicts, thereby enacting those very commitments to peace and pluralism to which Canadians declare allegiance. Such a curriculum of conflict encourages the continuing expression of difference, as well as ongoing study of unpeace. Bickmore asserts that violence is not inevitable, that its underlying conflictual causes can be satisfied, redirected, ended, or mended, that nonviolence can in fact be taught. Parenthetically, so did Freud, by the way, although not as confidently as Bickmore. Bickmore shows that meaningful peace-building education, while challenging, is nonetheless possible in public schools. How, you ask? Peace-building, Bickmore explains, involves multi-dimensional ongoing efforts to transform the causes of conflict, then to redress and repair their disproportionate harm to the most vulnerable. That occurs by helping students to acquire language, concepts, skills, and relationships for recognizing, communicating, and deliberating about the cultural and social structural causes and consequences of destructive conflicts, and about what people can do collectively about these problems. In so doing, demonstrating that the school curriculum can support youth development of agency for transformative peace building. What undermines peace building is that the curriculum tends to be skewed by unjust social structures and oppressive cultural beliefs and practices, often shifting responsibilities for achieving just peace onto individuals, instead of enabling and inspiring them to probe social, structural, cultural, and political factors that constrain as well as enable their agency. As we'll see in a moment, Judith Butler also demotes the role of the individual in nonviolence. Despite the omnipresence of injustice, Bickmore remains guardedly optimistic that the curriculum can help more young people, more of the time, to develop capabilities and motivating relationships for handling complex contemporary justice conflicts. In fact, when multiple dimensions of conflicts and potential peace-building action options are included in the curriculum, when teachers find ways to listen and to support their self-expression and action roles, the curriculum can create space for young people to develop hope and capabilities to build just peace in their own and others' lives. Building just peace in our own and others' lives was primary among Jane Addams' achievements, for which she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. I take my title from Jane Addams' The Subjective Necessity for Social Settlements, published in 1892. An essay in which Addams explains that her social settlement, Hull House in Chicago, was an effort to add the social function to democracy, an effort that rested on the theory and dependence of classes on each other. Addams tells us the title refers to her analysis of the motives which underline a movement based not only on conviction, but genuine emotion. She parcels her motives into three. The first being, quote, the desire to make the entire social organism democratic, to extend democracy beyond its political expression. The second is the impulse to share the race life and to build as much as possible of social energy and the accumulation of civilization to those portions of the race which have had little. The third springs from a certain renaissance of Christianity, a movement toward its early humanitarian aspects. Quotes, go ahead. Race here means the human race or species. Social organism implies that society is alive, and despite political, class, and ethnic divisions, is one entity. Civilization implies the centrality of reason in the expression of emotion, and that certain renaissance of Christianity seems less doctrinal than communitarian in its insistence on the equality of human beings. In contemporary America, at least among left and left-leaning academicians, talk of Christ connotes not left-wing but right-wing political activism, and specifically Christian nationalism, a topic James Burns discusses in his new book. But recall that Christ has also been cast, even in America, as a left-wing internationalist, including in curriculum studies, in that sector of scholarship Understanding Curriculum as Theological Text, we outlined an understanding curriculum, a sector influenced by liberation theology, as well as by progressive Jewish thought and activism. I think of Pasolini's portraiture of Jesus as a social revolutionary in his 1964 film. Obviously, Addams had access to none of that, but there was in her time a progressive pulse to Christianity, even some association with progressivism, even socialism. That progressive pulse, what Addams affirms as social service, led her also to pen the essay, The Objective Value of a Social Settlement. Here, however, I focus on subjective necessity, not of social settlements, but of nonviolence itself also with objective value, as the problem of violence, as Burns puts it, plugs us all. It was racial violence that prompted Bayard Rustin's affirmation of nonviolence, the focus of Fragment 3. This is nonviolence as political strategy. Rustin merits a central place in the national memory, John D'Amelio asserts. He was a key figure of his time. And more than anyone else, Rustin brought the message and methods of Gandhi to the United States. Indeed, it was Rustin who insinuated nonviolence into the heart of the Black freedom struggle, convinced that violence could never bring justice and that war could never bring peace. An internationalist long before globalization became a catchword in American life, Rustin knew that ordinary individuals could make a vast difference in the world, and he communicated his conviction widely. If Rustin is insufficiently recognized today, although there is a Netflix documentary, perhaps you've seen it, it is D'Amelio's effects, because he was a gay man in an era when the stigma attached to this was unrelieved. D'Amelio deems Rustin the perfect mentor for Martin Luther King Jr. Rustin, a subjective synthesis of Quaker, Gandhian, and Marxist perspectives that was unusual, if not unique, enabling Rustin to become a radical strategist able to combine vision, values, and program. Rustin's mark on both the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, and that's where and when he first met King, as a nationally significant event, and his mark on the evolution of King as the nation's foremost leader of nonviolent civil rights struggle was profound. D'Amelio concluding that Rustin was responsible for installing nonviolence into the very heart of what would become the most powerful social movement in 20th century America. But, D'Amelio adds, discerning that contribution isn't easy, as despite being assertive in private, Rustin worked to erase himself in public, an ongoing effort he made in part due to his Quaker and Gandhian modesty, but also due to his arrest, perhaps most prominently in Pasadena, California, for acting out his homosexual desire. This self-concealment was not only self-focused, but also conveyed his concern that his legal record might jeopardize the movement to which he had dedicated his life. In King's subsequent account of the Montgomery boycott, Rustin received no mention, and other accounts accord him only a marginal role. The truth is that King came to rely on Rustin almost at once. Rustin recalling that, quoting Rustin, my presence there was incommensurate and stimulating to Martin. I think he totally depended on me. Not that I was always right, but I would tell him the truth. Rustin and King met secretly in Birmingham concerning the financial support that boycott required, and specifically regarding what funds those in the North might donate. King, Rustin remembered, asked about nonviolent resistance, wondering what strategies might maintain the vibrancy of the protest. King also required a ghostwriter, since the protest left him no time for writing. Rustin went to work right away, starting an article while in Alabama, finishing it the day he returned to New York, mailing it that same day to King. As he acted, so he wrote. Sounding like Alain Locke, Rustin wrote that the boycotts announced the arrival of a new Negro, excuse me, with a revolutionary change in the Negro's evaluation of himself, and a heightened consciousness that economics is part of the civil rights struggle. And finally, the protesters were employing a new and powerful weapon, nonviolent resistance. He assured King that he had accepted the moral aspects of the protest, that he asked permission to publish the piece under King's name, in the April issue of the magazine Liberation. It was King's first publication. D'Amelio points out that King's acceptance of Rustin's writing implies his trust of Rustin's ability to characterize King's crusade in terms that the novice activist felt able to embrace. Rustin, of course, is most remembered as the organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, assembling 250,000 protesters. As you know, King closed his address with an image of all Americans joining hands together, singing, in the words of the old spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Rustin remembered the electricity in the air. Everyone who was there knew that the event was a landmark, one of the great days in American history, and D'Amelio adds, perhaps the greatest of Rustin's life. Fragment number 4, interdependency. That Rustin brought off, with the help of many others, one of the great days in American history, is my segue to fragment. Interdependency, a term Judith Butler invokes as affirming the social necessity of nonviolence, its social necessity for me implied, and its subjective necessity. Butler emphasizes that oneself is implicated in another self, rendering nonviolence an acknowledgement of that prior social relatedness. Pinpointing individualism as the culprit, she critiques the concept, as nonviolence cannot, she insists, be predicated on individualism. Even this defender of the individual wouldn't want to predicate nonviolence on any asocial conception. Neither nonviolence nor the concept of the individual is asocial. Butler doesn't see the individual as asocial either, noting that if one is constituted through one's relationships with others, then part of self-preservation implies preservation of the social ties that define the self and its world. Here, Butler is admitting that social ties aren't always, let's say, supportive, even in peacetime. Certainly not during times, as Bickmore puts it, unpeace. Admitting that, quoting, relationality is not by itself a good thing, a sign of connectedness, an ethical norm to be posited over and against destruction. Rather, relationality is a vexed and ambivalent field in which the question of ethical obligation has to be worked out in light of a persistent and constitutive destructive potential, both put. Butler concludes by adding that ethical action is never exclusively reflexive, meaning that it can never be reliant upon the self-relation alone. Not self-evident is the situation, often if not always involving others, human and non-human, as embedded within it oneself, while obviously not dependent only on one's relationship with oneself. Ethical action is also obviously dependent on the self-self relation. For example, childhood abuse can become internalized, becoming self-abuse, and then the abuse of others. Butler considers interdependency a condition of equality, an ideal without which she thinks nonviolence becomes unintelligible. Recall Rustin's invocation of nonviolence in service to equality, at first racial and then late in his life to gender equality. Emphasizing equality's relational nature, acknowledging that our relationality can also be the source of its self-destruction. An admission reminded me of Sartre's quip, hell is other people, and Freud's pessimism concerning the control of human aggression, which Butler herself discusses later in the book. Butler again worries we overlook our interdependency and the vulnerability it installs if we dwell on nonviolence as an individual mode of life. Toward the end of the book, Butler reaffirms her vows, insisting that vulnerability is no attribute of the human subject, but instead a feature of social relations. Although that abstraction she quickly genders, suggesting that skepticism toward nonviolence and its devaluation as only passive derives from another dualism, that is, construing femininity as passive, masculinity as active. Whether gendered or not, declining to act is not necessarily doing nothing, Butler observes, and there are times when simply surviving is sufficient. Butler concludes as she began, calling for a new imaginary, one that affirms our interdependency. In my view, curriculum emphasizing dependency, interdependency, and the nonviolence these require would be a social psychoanalytic one, cultivating reasoned interpretations informed by evidence, argument, and imagination, an effort to free us from the ongoing trauma of human history. Let's look to history for a precedent supporting an intra-psychic strategy for affirming nonviolence. Fragment number 5, detachment. The historical precedent I have in mind is unfashionably Western, even British, in fact, Victorian. What Amanda Anderson terms the powers of distance communicates the considerable benefits of distancing oneself from the norms and conventions that characterize the common sense of any era. Although, as with the Victorians, the subject of Addams' study, there can be, quote, ambivalence and uncertainty about the significant consequences of such practices. She uses distance interchangeably with detachment, the latter term meant to encompass not only science, critical reason, disinterested in realism, but also a set of practices of the self, ranging from Stoicism to cosmopolitanism to dandyism. Yes, she has Oscar Wilde in mind. Anderson acknowledges that detachment takes many forms and produces many different effects, including harmful ones. But she defends, quote, the progressive potentiality of those modern practices that aim to objectify facets of human existence, so to better understand, criticize, and at times transform them. A practice, she reminds, that marks the project of the Enlightenment and its legacy. The promises and dangers of distance, she notes, were understood as practices having an intimate and profound bearing on moral character. The past tense, because Anderson is studying the Victorian preoccupation with detachment, an era now often denounced, but as her study underlines, still with powerful potential for the cultivation of character, both drawing on and transforming the tradition of Bildung, and I would add, Carrere. In affinity with concepts and traditions from which Han Yuan works, Ubuntu, Buddhist non-duality, and Taoist yin-yang dynamics, Victorian conceptions on cosmopolitanism included, quote, reflective distance from one's original or primary cultural affiliations, a broad understanding of other cultures and customs, a belief in universal humanity. Anderson notes that the relative weight assigned to these three constituent elements can vary, as can the forms of identification against which reflexive distance is defined. In antiquity, for example, in the early elaboration of cosmopolitanism by the Cynics and the Stoics, cosmopolitan detachment challenged confined perspectives and affirmed the perspective of the poles. During the Enlightenment, detachment was defined against the narrow allegiances of religion, class, and even the state. It would include both intellectual and ethical dimensions, with a prominent emphasis on the practice of self-cultivation. Not until the 19th century did cosmopolitan detachment become defined in relation to nationalism, although even then still conveyed the ethos associated with the Enlightenment. Of course, we in the West must confront the past, including legacies of imperialism, colonialism, and genocide. But it's also true that these are hardly confined to the West. No exoneration, but a reminder that the human capacity to become inhuman has not been segregated in one place, and no matter how very long time, among only one set of people or peoples. Western civilization, like McSweeney, I capitalize the term to indicate that it's an invented abstract category rather than a neutral descriptive term, can inform our understanding of nonviolence, specifically late Victorian conceptions of attachment. Fragment number 6, Sisyphus. I close this fragmentary course of study of nonviolence with Camus' consideration of Sisyphus, a myth that for Camus constitutes a call to life amidst death. Camus writing the essay in 1940, Europe then submerged in the deadliest conflict humanity has ever undertaken. In contrast to Einstein's exchange with Freud, Camus ponders not world peace, ending aggression against others, but self-directed violence, the question of suicide. This resounds in curriculum studies as the problem of being between hope and despair, first formulated by Roger Simon, that third in-between space being, I suggest, one of resolve. Yes, a form of synthesis, that final phase of the method of Carrere. but also a solidification of emotion, of what Jane Addams called conviction, the idea with which I started. No solidification or conviction for Camus. He is focused on the worm in the human heart. Suicide also a form of confession. Recall Christopher Cruise's conception of curriculum as confession. Confession that life lacks any profound meaning, that there is no compensation for a daily life that can seem insane. Camus calling that daily agitation all topped off by the pointlessness of suffering. Understanding, Camus suggests, sounding phenomenological, is not a matter of explaining and solving, but of experiencing and describing. But surely the understanding involves all four. Where we concur occurs in his next sentence. Everything begins with lucid indifference. Detachment, distance, non-attachment, indifference. Each of these overlapping concepts implies non-coincidence with reality, what Camus terms intelligence refusal to reason the concrete, in which the eye registers what happens. The concrete may resist reason, but it welcomes the senses. The abstract in abeyance allows the triumph of the carnal. For me, not only an affirmation of aspects of 19th century and not only French decadentism, but only a repudiation of modernity to my, only a repudiation of modernity, but to my mind, a political project, an anti-racist shattering of racist subjectivity. Today, Camus writes, when thought has ceased to lay claim to the universal, when its best history would be that of repentances, we know that the system, when it is worthwhile, cannot be separated from its author. We are, of course, interdependent, as Butler emphasizes. And yes, the individual can be considered a singularization of the universal. But neither insight refutes the fact that human reality is thought, and in some sense even authored, by the libelously belittled individual. Indeed, Butler writes elsewhere, quoting her, thinking, like other solitary and even private activities, distant from actions, takes place between me and myself, or in dialogue with the other. For Camus, the purpose of being human is presence, to maintain awareness, requiring discipline as well as patience and lucidity. Key is creation. For Camus, the quote, staggering evidence of man's soul dignity, the dogged revolt against his condition, preservations in an effort considered sterile. In this course, we can't help but think of revolt against violence, perseverance, conviction for Jane Addams, and result for me, that makes our cause crystallize in thought and action, continuing against all odds, like Rustin, seeking peace and pleasure. Camus emphasizes the dailiness of our effort, and that effort dependent upon self-mastery, and that following from and contributing to subjective coherence that enables lucidity, a precise estimate of the limits of truth, measure, and strength. Camus reminds us that the gods had condemned Sisyphus to roll a rock up a mountainside to its summit, at which point it would fall back down. No punishment more dreadful than such futile and hopeless labor. You probably guessed already that Sisyphus is Camus' absurd hero. His passion for life won him that unspeakable penalty, in which the whole being is exerted toward accomplishing nothing. For Camus, quoting, this is the price that must be paid for the passions of this earth. Apparently, Sisyphus can afford to pay, as he is stronger than his rock. His punishment at times bringing him sorrow, but also joy. Camus concluding, quote, this world is not too much. Indeed, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Maybe more than inner peace, happiness may be the ultimate form of nonviolence. And not only subjectively, as happiness can be contagious. Happiness transcends hope and despair, somehow suturing the wound between humanity's basic absurdity and implacable nobility, Camus' two poles of the human condition. Or Camus meaning that once the absurdity of our all-too-human situation is recognized and accepted, that once we are resigned to it, the human condition has ceased to be absurd. Recognition and acceptance of as well as resignation to the ongoing metaphysical revolution that is our fate. These would seem to be, for Camus for sure, among the dynamics of hovering between hope and despair, a subjective state of detachment that encourages coherence, synthesis, even result. These registering a specific reconfiguration of the self that swerves toward nonviolence. Instead of being whistleblowed between opposites, the self can be restructured to accommodate ambivalence, dwelling in between, hovering on that Iokian bridge that is no conveyance, but a suspension, connecting us neither to this nor that, but to both and, self-suspended, detached, distance from what it experiences through the calm that is the I. Yes, a figure of speech, but also the source, entrusted with a gift of your life, a gift to be preserved, calling us to affirm the subjective necessity of nonviolence. And that is the larger story these fragments tell. Thank you.